Hello, everybody. This is Salil Tripathi from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, and I'm on the telephone with Usha Ramanathan, who is a legal scholar in India and has played a pivotal role in several major human rights struggles in India, those dealing with poverty, with Bhopal and the Union Carbide disaster of 1984, and also the unique identification system of India, the so called Aadhaar card. Usha, welcome. What I would like to talk today to you particularly about is the theme around which our podcasts are structured this year for top 10, which is on the issue of remedy. We know the state duty to protect, we know
Right.
the responsibility of the companies to respect, but the gap of remedies. And the issue that
Right.
I wanted to talk to you about in particular was big data. I mean, the assumption is that big data is some kind of a nirvana which is going to solve
Right.
all our problems because it will enable the state to provide services quicker and identify those in need much faster. But clearly,
Right.
it has significant human rights constraints and impacts for that. What are those risks briefly, and then where the gaps exist, how can we look of ways to ameliorate the situation to remedies?
First of all, hello, Salil. I'm happy to be speaking to you on this subject because it's really something that I think all of us need to apply ourselves to, especially because things seem to be changing every day. And every day we only know a part of the problem. So when we are talking about remedy, we are not just talking about things that have happened, which we understand and for which we need remedies, that we are also thinking about things that have begun to happen and are impending. I have to say, which imprints almost like doom. So, just a couple of things. The first thing is that, there's an assumption which we are all asked to make that technology is neutral, that technology is benign, and that technology is infallible, and that technology is incorruptible. So, these are assumptions on which we are asked to accept this idea of the use of data which technology is able to manufacture for various purposes. So, if I were to look at some of the ways in which this is changing the way in which we live, and the kind of remedies, therefore, we have to look for, one of those is that, we've had for years the idea that when something goes wrong, you need to have an investigation, you need to have systems of investigation, which protects human rights and which protects the fundamental rights of people and is yet able to arrive at some kind of an understanding of what the situation is and if it's an offense to punish people. We've already moved from this idea of investigation into preventive. In criminal law, we have this idea of preventing crime. And I find that with technology, it has now moved into predictive systems where technology and big data will be able to predict many situations. Now, what kind of remedy do we find when it is about predictive, and what are the kind of problems that emerge which need remedies? One of the ways that the problem emerges is in the context of algorithms, because very often big data is coupled with the idea of algorithms. And as we know by now, and a lot of literature has come on this, algorithms are invariably carry the prejudices of the person who helps in creating the algorithm. And I think recent experience also tells us that even when it is machine learning, it is the prejudices that keep getting multiplied in dangerous and scary ways. We call it here a case of Bentham meeting Kafka, where big data is about creates various kinds of panopticons, and then it comes through various bureaucratic systems that are themselves deeply fallible. And therefore, the algorithm, which is a technological innovation, meets Kafka, where bureaucracy is completely foxes about where we are. So any remedy that we look at will have to account for the control that we need to restore to people about their own identities, about their own data, and about the way they are represented on all these various kinds of technology platforms. So that would be my first and immediate response.
So if we look at the ICT sector, the information and communication technology, and of course big data is not only about ICT. I mean, it applies to the grocery stores from which we buy things. It applies to companies which have the technology to, light up the city, the traffic lights of the city, and they can capture data of cars that are passing and sound that is recorded. But let's stay focused on the technology companies. If we look at the multi-stakeholder initiatives that technology companies have developed, then the one that comes to mind is, of course, the Global Network Initiative, which has done some work in terms of identifying ways in which you can deal with companies which are made difficult demands by difficult countries. So the classic example being Yahoo in China, for example, being asked to
Right.
hand over data, and they've tried to come up
Right.
with some response mechanisms for that. And as you know from our
Right.
own work at IHRB, we have also looked at some cases where you have companies which have tried to do some predictive work in terms of identifying hate speech during, say, the elections in Kenya, or stopping
Right.
all internet connectivity in Pakistan during. Now, the purpose of giving these examples is that to me it seems as if we have isolated responses to
Right.
specific problem, but nothing that is comprehensive to address
Right.
the issues raised by, even if I were to be very neutral and say the issues and challenges raised by big data. Is that fair? There's no collective response. That's what I'm getting at.
What I'm finding is two things which I think explain to me why perhaps this is not happening, or three things. One is that there is actually a lot of incomprehension about how this works. And those who are data controllers or those who are creating businesses out of this are the only ones who know what they are doing, and the rest of us are left guessing most of the time. So, because we can't identify the problem clearly, we find ourselves unable to find redress when the problem comes in, because we haven't yet got a language for the kind of problem that we have. The second thing that I find is that, in the Indian context, for instance, it is technology companies that are they are collaborating with the state to be able to create surveillance systems, because the state has one kind of interest of surveillance and the technology companies have another kind of market and other related surveillance. So in this kind of collaboration, it's very difficult for the ordinary person to find avenues of redress, because between the two most powerful entities have become collaborative in this.
Right.
The third thing, which I think is as disturbing, is if you look at the richest people in the world today, and when we say richest people, we're really talking about the top richest, maybe the top 10 people. You find that 5 of them come from the technology world. And they not only control the technology companies, they are also beginning to control philanthropy, which means where the money will go to set right what is going wrong.
Right.
And so when we talk remedy, we need to recognize that these are the obstacles that we have to cross before we can reach remedy. So episodically, big data, those who are promoting the idea of big data, they say two things. One is that where there is big data, we can identify the problem quickly and therefore we can find an answer to that problem. But many of them I've found really make no sense at all, because if, for instance, there's plague in a place, you don't need big data to tell us that there is plague. What you need is a responsive state and a responsive medical establishment which will immediately go in and act. And you have the data when your system works. And if your system doesn't work, this data makes no sense. So we need to look at how the justification of this idea of big data is happening. Also, because I remember at the beginning of this, when the discussion started on all of this, we used to say at least it should be anonymized. And now we find that the distance between big data and granular data is shrinking every day. So that de-anonymization is the simplest thing that is done now, because of the way granular data and big data are becoming close. So all of this becomes significant. And the other very important thing is that it is presumed that if there is something that somebody thinks is good for people therefore don't need to have rights. Right. They just need to have these services given to them. So I think the restoration of rights to people, a simple thing, like in India we have a thing where, I leave it to you to make sense of this, but we have what we call coerced voluntary consent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how can you have consent which is coerced? I mean, I don't think I even need to, I don't need to elaborate on this.
Yeah.
But it is saying that you can cease to exist as a person if you do not give your consent. Now, this kind of distortion, will have to be addressed squarely, and there will have to be penalties that are put on people who coerce, never mind what the context.
Obviously, when you pose something, as you put it, that we are seeing the beginning of a problem, which we are still trying to understand and articulate it, so finding the remedy becomes harder. Simplest solution that we know from the human rights system is developing safeguards. Can you think of safeguards that can be created for something like this? Is it through the judiciary? Is it through vigilance by the society?
So I find that there are a few things that are very interesting in this. One, again, from our experience in India, where the government of the day went to the court and said that people of this country don't have a right to privacy. And they said that in the context of a technology-driven project, where everybody would be basically put into various platforms and identified and tagged and creating this kind of superstructure under which you would just be, it's like the panopticon being created for all of us. And the first thing, of course, is that whenever any kind of new system that comes in believes that you have to, abandon the idea of rights, because that system is not going to be able to operate within a human rights framework, which includes, for instance, the right to privacy, then I think it's not about regulation, it is about rejection. And that's the first step. The interesting thing about all this also is that the rules of liability have simply not been formulated at all. And this is because of the way technology has been treated as if it's some kind of a panacea or, for many ills. And like it doesn't come with any problem. So I think it's important that we start articulating the rules of liability, partly because it is putting us into systems of surveillance, partly because, like we've seen here again, it decides who to exclude, who to switch off, who is relevant. Each of these comes with a whole set of problems. So this power should always come with structures of liability. Mm. And technology is producing enormous power in certain sectors. So I think liability is an important part. I think we do need to acknowledge that there is some interesting jurisprudence that's coming out about the right to be forgotten. And it's a very important kind of right which we need to look at. The third is that there have to be systems by which we restore control to people over their own identities and over the kind of data that's out there about themselves. The fourth is that none of this should be allowed to be done without a law that precedes it. Now what happens, they do everything and then they create a law that will make it possible for them to carry on with what they are doing. I think that simply has to stop. The fifth is that we do need regulators, but I don't think we can depend upon regulators. Yet I think not doing with a regulator is not an answer to that. We do need regulators. And in the case of systems that create surveillance structures, I think there has to be dismantling the structure and not tinkering with it. Very importantly, when we say privacy by design, for instance, or rights by design, the design of technology has to conform to human rights jurisprudence. And it's interesting because in 1991, when the liberalization process started and all the priorities started changing, the whole idea was to reconfigure all our economies to suit the market economy. At that time, I remember economists telling us at meetings that economics is not confined by the Constitution. The Constitution deals with your life, but this is economics. Now, technology is telling us the same thing. We have to not just challenge it, but we have to put that idea down.
That's a formidable change. And thank you so much, Usha, for this, and all the best with your work.